author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Illegal immigration is the hottest topic gripping America and indeed the rest of the Western world this year. We're going deep dive and go down some oft ignored rabbit holes on today's special edition show. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. This is our illegal immigration special edition. We're examining the issues, the questions, and the alleged imponderables. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. With Joe Biden's talk of a booming economy enabled and echoed by his friends in the left-leaning media, it seems a multitude of sins are covered by this optimism. From exploited illegal aliens to underage workers, there's a darkness in the labor market that, if it were properly exposed, would send chills down the spines of many. Now, someone who's been covering this topic extensively on the pages of LibertyNation.com is author and political columnist Joe Schaefer, who joins us for this special illegal immigration edition today. Welcome back to the show, Joe.
Thanks for having me, Mark. I just feel like this is such a particularly important topic, so I'm really happy to be here.
Well, you know, the generalized topic of illegal immigration, that is now number two in the United States as the most important issue, and also the issue that people are going to be voting on in the November 2024 election. Now, obviously, the economy is always number one, but so much of the economy is tied in with practices and happenings that are taking place due to, through, because of, and in relation to illegal immigration. Now, let's start with an outline of, I guess, the topic that animates us both the most is child labor, illegal immigrant child labor in dangerous conditions. Can you give us an overview of what's been happening recently and what the trend is, please, Joe?
Sure. I've written about 4 or 5 articles, I think, in the past year about this, and I'm happy to see it being reported even by the mainstream big box media, which I'm, of course, highly critical of. But, you know, you can't really cover this up anymore. The latest article I had in NBC reported this to their credit. Let me look at my notes here. Over 800 child labor investigations in 47 states right now. That's what the federal government is doing. So this has exploded. We all
let's just make a point that that's what the federal government's doing. There's also state and local investigations. So it's not just there's 800 cases. There's exponentially more happening. Correct. Sorry, carry on.
Correct. And you know, there's no mystery why it's happening. You've got this surge of unaccompanied minors coming to the United States, and now we have this surge of child labor, most of them coming from Central America. Gee, this is a real difficult puzzle to put together. Illegal immigration is driving this, and the employers know, in my opinion, if you read the articles, and we'll get into that, know what they are doing. And to me, the big scandal is the federal government talks a good game about their investigations, and it's just a slap on the wrist when they actually come to disciplining them. No, there's no chance of jail time. The fines are absolutely minimal. When I wrote about the most recent case, 16-year-old Guatemalan boy, 16 years old.
Duvan Perez.
He had in Mississippi chicken poultry processing plant. He had an ID that said he was 32 years old. And there are pictures of the lad. It's not even close. It's not even close. So they know this is fraudulent. They know he's from Central America. We've had a local reporter down in Mississippi saying these companies specifically recruit people in Central America. So they know they're getting illegal aliens, and they know that there's no way this kid was 32 years old. So again, they know what they're doing. The company involved, Marjack, over $354 million in annual revenues last year. They were fined $200,000 for the death of a child. That's less than 1% of their annual revenues. This is not a deterrent to stop this. And so it's not going to stop. It's just going to continue, because why should they stop? It's deliberate. And you know, we really need laws. There are actions on the state and the federal level to actually have prison time for these violations. And to me, until that happens, nothing is going to change. It's just going to keep exploding. And of course, the calamity on the southern border is contributing to it mightily.
So there's a, if we just talk tangentially about the political aspect of this tragic death, Duvan Perez, 16 years old, um, you have one side of the political aisle in the United States bemoaning the open borders that lets people through without proper checks, without knowing who they are. You have the other side that's clearly advocating for open borders, a come one, come all mentality. And yet the side that's advocating for open borders, they're criticizing big business for exploiting workers. But if the borders were closed, they wouldn't be able to exploit these people who are willing to hire 16-year-old children and younger, I might add, for dangerous jobs that could end in injury or even death, as has happened on numerous occasions. But it seems that they're completely at odds with each other, both sides of the aisle. But if one side had what the other side wanted, the other side wouldn't get what that side didn't want them to have. And so if they would, do you see, there wouldn't be the exploitation if there wasn't the flow of illegal immigrants. And so
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying.
it's like you'd think on this one thing, it's like that they could perhaps come together. We don't want exploitation of people. Okay, and this side doesn't want open borders. So if we stop the border, then you won't have either one. You won't have the open borders, and you won't have the exploitation. And it really makes it sound hollow. You know, when we often hear, if it saves just one life, well, one life could have been saved, couldn't it? Duvan Perez. Now, let's talk about Duvan Perez. Now, clearly, he looked like a kid, as you pointed out. And the idea that anyone could seriously judge him to be in his 30s, it's ridiculous. There are photos online. So he was using not a fake ID, but someone's actual ID with a social security number. And this angle's rarely explored. It's like, are people letting others use their identification? Are they being sold or rented out? Or were they stolen?
Apparently, a lot of them are being stolen. According to reports, there were at least three, and I think it was more, people living in the town with a poultry plant saying their identities were stolen and used for people who were working at this poultry plant. So,
I mean, that's not a hard crime to figure out, right? So your ID's being stolen, okay. And then where is it being used? Well, it's being used here by this person. It's quite easy. You know, it doesn't take, we don't need Columbo on this one or Angela Lansbury. We don't need them to come in and solve this particular crime because, you know, they're registering their social security numbers with the things. But you and I would be investigated for using somebody else's ID. But there must be literally hundreds of thousands of illegal workers in the United States, at least. And they're all using some kind of ID. This is like an invasion of privacy, an ID catastrophe on an unheard scale. Yet we hear crickets about that aspect of it. Why is that?
well, you know, it's what they say about Joe Biden. We don't need to pass more laws to secure the border. It's already illegal to cross into this country. They just don't want to enforce the law. And so based on I've really dug into this over the past year. It seems on all sides, they don't want to enforce the law. You talked about those two sides. Well, you know, they do. Maybe they both want the same things. They want open borders.
That was my implication. Yeah, that
the people who want to change our society, they see a value in bringing all these foreigners into our country, and the people running these plants making a lot of money. They love the cheap labor. So there's this left-right divide, and these people are on opposite sides. Well, they're really not on opposite sides to a great extent. And, you know, we're seeing this in the Senate immigration bill right now, where you have these Republicans like James Langford in Oklahoma, Tom Tillis, who I've written about extensively. He owes his entire political career to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which loves cheap illegal alien labor. These people are acting like, we have to give amnesty. We have to let a certain amount of foreign workers in, and then we can secure the border. No, you can secure the border right now. You don't have to pass a single law. They don't want to do it. The federal government, with these slaps on the wrist, when a 16-year-old boy is sucked into a machine and killed, and they're only fined $200,000 and they bring in $354 million revenue. What message are they sending? Keep doing it. Go ahead. Go ahead and keep doing it. And, I've written about this so many times. They're not even hiding it anymore. There is I've written about the dairy industry, which is very corrupt in this issue. They intentionally hire illegal aliens. They don't even hide it. A very wealthy dairy farmer in Wisconsin came out and said, every time an American worker quits, I hire a Mexican. And he was bragging about it, because of course he's happy about it. They'll work for cheap. They won't complain, and they'll do all the hard work that it's to do. If you want to stop this for the American people, if you don't want this to continue, we have to start asking ourselves some serious questions about the very nature of agriculture in this country today. And, you should have John Clark, our colleague, on it because he knows about it so much more than I do. But we've turned agriculture, we've turned food into a factory job. And it's really not really, food is what's meant to sustain life. So when we talk about this illegal immigration, the consequences, it impacts every single American in ways that they should know. This company is hiring a 16-year-old with an ID saying he's 32. They really don't care that he gets maimed on the job. And you're trusting them to process the food that you eat, that goes into your body. Why should they have any more regard for us? And when they have this callous disregard for their own workers, and it's all in the name of profit. It's because food is like a widget nowadays. And I just really think the American consumer needs to ask themselves some tough questions. It can be about ideology, but it can just be about your own health. We have an obesity crisis. We have autoimmune disease crisis at the same time that this illegal alien workforce has taken over agriculture. Is there really no connection? The timeline is identical. So these are the tough questions I really truly believe the American people need to ask themselves. What are you spending your money on when you purchase food?
And Joe, that is a series of great questions. Hopefully we'll address a few of them when we come back after this short break. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. We're here talking with Joe Schaefer, discussing illegal immigration at large and specifically how this impacts underage workers and the tragic consequences of that. Now, Joe, in many cases, we assume that these children are entering into a work contract, an agreement with the company, so they're making a decision. Like, obviously loads of 14-year-olds have jobs. I was 13, 14 years old when I started my first job. It wasn't exploitative in any way, though. I didn't feel as exploitative, certainly. But you got the 14-year-olds, they work at Burger King, serving at the till. It's not a dangerous work, but we assume that, for example, people like Duvan Perez, who we discussed in the first segment of this, who died, tragic factory accident. But we assume that they enter into these contracts voluntarily, but that's not always the case. And recently, I think you wrote about this. There's a case in Virginia last year of a cleaning company who, let's say employed for now, but I'm going to whack those air quotes around the word employed, a 13-year-old girl who the prosecutors argued when they brought this case to court that she was forced to work the night shift. This was clearly a case of human trafficking, but still people are turning a blind eye to this, other than enforcing laws that each company has to have an anti-slavery statement on their website or something. Other than that, we're literally witnessing what you would term modern day slavery happening in the factories, and all because of what? Because these companies they're not really facing a penalty. Joe, your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that you hit it on the head with those two words, human trafficking. When you hear that phrase, we think of the Mexican cartels, who bring in these people for a fee. We think of sex trafficking. But, human trafficking is big when it comes to labor. We talked about the Mississippi local reporter who talks about these firms actively recruiting in Guatemala and bringing these people into the country and then paying them slave wages to do grueling, difficult, and we now know lethally dangerous labor That is human trafficking, and they're doing it for a profit, just like the cartels are, just like the sex traffickers are. But because they are large companies, somehow we think that that makes it okay. So it goes back to the nature of how work has changed. And this is another point that I think the American people need to think about, is how this diminishes the respect for labor for all of us. It diminishes it for everybody. You talked about having a job, when you were 13, 14. Well, I was 13, 14, 40 years ago. I'm an old man. And, the conditions were a lot different. My first job was with a big supermarket, but they were a local chain, in the state I lived in. Today, you have these multinational corporations. They have no ties to the community. And I call it's the perfect phrase for the deliberate stranger. They don't want to know the people they are hiring, because then you have to treat them like a human being. This is an important quote I'd like to make. Jack Welch, who is the legendary CEO of General Electric, considered this god of modern day capitalism, multinational capitalism, which has caused so many problems, with what we have globalism today. He had this famous quote saying, companies should be put on barges and float down the river. So in case a different country changes their laws so they're unfavorable for the economic conditions of the company, you can just float down the river. So what kind of loyalty to the community is being expressed by that sentiment? It's the deliberate stranger. It's a lack of respect for the people you are employing. And if you think it's going to stop with illegal aliens, look at everything that's happened to the American worker, the capital that they've lost over the last 30 years, less benefits, less wages. You can't support a family on one salary anymore. Again, these things are not isolated incidents. They all go together, and illegal immigration is a big part of it, but it is part of something much bigger.
I want to look at that. So you say that conditions for workers, a lot of people would argue that conditions for workers are much better than they were in the past. But I think that's really missing the point. When people make this general analogy, general point that things are better now for workers than they were in the past, they're talking about, the workhouses of 150 years ago, or that they're talking, just on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, where people were essentially slave labor again there. In fact, going back a little further, they actually were. But when you think about maybe mid-1950s, early 1960s, and then you consider what work could do for you then, there was a lot of, what's the word? There was a lot of dignity in having a job and being able to go out and provide for a family on your wage. The white picket fence, home ownership was high, car ownership, all these fancy newfangled gadgets like, an oven, and things were coming into the house. And the wage went a lot further. Now, sure, there's inflation, but there's a lot of economic things happening here, which, again, a lot of them are tied to mass illegal immigration. Because if you have a workforce that's willing to work without regulation, and this is the only time you'll ever hear me say this, without unions to support them in their rights, the only time you'll ever hear me say that, what do you expect? Things are going to get worse. Anyway, we'll be right back with Joe Schaefer, carrying on this very, very important topic after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back here on Liberty Nation Radio with our special guest, Joe Schaefer. Now, we've been talking about illegal immigration, the exploitation that goes along with that. And now Joe and I were talking off camera about an old book, well, not that old, I guess, but that we both read. It's called Fast Food Nation. And I guess the part that we were discussing there, Joe, was about a company going into Nebraska and saying that it's ready to be part of the community. Could you just outline that for us?
Sure. I mean, the book's about 20 years old now, and to me, it's more relevant than ever. I actually haven't read it in several years, but it's really, parts of it have really stuck with me. The guy just did a good job of muckraking, and it's hard to refute a lot of what he had to say. And he was talking about a town, I believe it was in Nebraska, I'm pretty sure that's right. A big poultry processing plant or whatever wanted to go into this town, and they had to sell it to the locals, the town council and the people. and they promised them the world. It's like, these are hardworking employees we're going to have here. They don't cause any trouble. They work hard during the day. They go to sleep. Everything's going to be fine, and the whole town's going to prosper. So they get their plant. It gets approved. The workforce is all foreigners, a lot of them illegal aliens. Crime skyrockets, drugs skyrocket, pollution skyrockets from the plant. This goes back to what we were talking about. Again, when you have a company that is only concerned with profits and has no interest in the local community whatsoever, you're going to have these things keep happening. And to me, the rise in an illegal alien workforce, the rise in child labor, which is just such a grotesque scandal, ultimately comes down to the frayed connection between employer and local community in the United States today. And you can call that a criticism of capitalism. You can call that a criticism of globalism. I'm not really interested in getting into an ideological fight on those grounds, but something is fundamentally wrong. And the answer, if you don't want to support this anymore, to me, is stop giving your money to these big corporations that obviously don't care about American communities anymore.
Yeah, it seems that as long as there's some support checks for donations for political campaigns and whatnot, or lobbying groups which have just unprecedented access to lawmakers, and they work for large corporations, mostly globalist corporations or corporations with a global outlook in terms of who they recruit, then things really are just going to continue. You've got this, I hate to call it a perfect storm, let's call it an imperfect storm, where you have paltry fines and slaps on the wrist for breaching what are already laws in this country, in the United States. You have borders wide open and a refusal to close them down, or to at least monitor the people who are coming in with some degree of both interest and respect for them as a person. You can say, well, it's no respect for their privacy to look into them, sure, but it's respect to stop the 16-year-old getting sucked into a deboning machine and killed. That's a certain amount of respect. And then you've got the third aspect of it, which is lobbyists have never been more prevalent, although obviously they're not all termed lobbyists nowadays. They're special interest groups. They're political action committees. They're NGOs helping the poor migrants across the country with envelopes of cash or debit cards, courtesy of the UN. Where does the UN get that money? US taxpayers. So it comes direct from authorized by Congress. And it's all this imperfect storm that guarantees one thing: the situation will continue. And we did mention this phrase before, Joe. We hear it a lot in political realms, and that is, if it saves one life. Now, we hear that most commonly about the gun control debate. And they say, well, we should do this because if it saves one life. Joe, rough estimate here, if I may. How many lives do you think would be saved in factories, fentanyl overdoses, crimes? We've heard about it in the hearings the other day, didn't we? A 17-year-old gang member who should have been flagged coming in because he was a known gang member, illegally getting into a car, killing a family. It's a disgrace. We heard about that in the hearings that took place the other week. How many lives would be saved then? Because I would bet that it's at least one. I would bet money that it's at least one life would be saved.
I'm so glad you brought this up, because it opens up something that I really want to talk about. And I can tell you about one potential life that could have been saved. And I hope this doesn't sound callous in any way, because it's not meant to be. But let's be honest here. The people pushing this nation-destroying wave that's going on in this country, they don't really care about average American lives. They didn't care about Kate Steinle when she was killed by an illegal alien in San Francisco, or Pierce Corcoran, or Molly Tibbetts. I can go on to other names. They don't care about them. I think it's very important to point out that until it affects them personally, nothing is going to change. And I've written about this in the past. I remember Bob Simon. He was at 60 Minutes, CBS guy. He was killed because the limo driver of the company that CBS had out was an Afghan refugee with serious mental problems, had attempted suicide, I think, multiple times, should never have been driving a limousine. He was driving his limousine and he crashed head on into traffic. But these things need to affect the elites, because when they affect the average Americans, they don't care. They don't care that it's affecting us. But when you talk about body counts, you got to bring it all up. You talk about fentanyl, you talk about crime, you talk about the health problems that we were discussing that come from the factory food that is the reason they hire this illegal alien workforce. I really truly believe you're talking about tens of millions of American lives that are affected by this construct that we have now that is feeding this illegal alien workforce that is now being specialized by child labor. So it's just going to it's a rolling ball. It's going to keep getting worse. And I do think it's important that, it is unfortunate, but it's important that they start to suffer like we have been suffering for decades now, and then things are going to really change.
You bring up a really important point, I think, regarding the impact on basically your average Americans, your average regular people, because obviously I'm from the United Kingdom, England, and I was very heavily involved in Brexit. It was my passion at the time was Brexit, and my reason behind it was sovereignty of the United Kingdom from the European Union. But one of the really big issues for many people was immigration, which, by the way, it was out of control and is still out of control, despite Brexit. But one of the big issues was that on one side, the Brexit side was arguing that mass immigration deflates wages. And the other side was saying, no. If you have a look at all the numbers, there's a net benefit of, from more immigration in terms of wage growth and productivity. Anyway, it turns out that both sides were right. But the caveat being that it only depresses wages for those who are on low wages anyway. So essentially it was making the poorer much poorer and the richer much richer, because, when it all averages out, it doesn't make a difference, right? But it's the very real effect on the people who are already at the bottom of the ladder that are feeling the squeeze from mass illegal immigration. And we'll be talking about that after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back here on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. On our special illegal immigration edition today, we've been speaking with Joe Schaefer, Liberty Nation's political columnist, who's written extensively on the child exploitation that takes place. And we've been covering the whole gamut of really what all the aspects are to this. But Joe, for our last part here, I really want to talk about how mass uncontrolled immigration hurts. It increases GDP, I believe. Overall, it increases the wealth with more immigration in some circles, but it's an uneven balance. So the rich or the wealthier tend to get wealthier due to this, as we've discussed. Because of course they can pay a pittance to the illegal immigrants because they don't have to worry about health, safety, regulations, even unions, things like that. But the people who are the most impacted are those who we would say they're on the bottom rungs of the ladder of American fiscal society. And in America, that's by and large, that's black folks, isn't it? And that's Hispanic folks, legal people who've come from south of the border and are now citizens of the United States. And I guess a lot of poor white folks in rural America, they're the people that are getting squeezed. The people who can least afford to get squeezed are the people getting squeezed. How does that work out?
I agree to that to a certain extent. I remember one of the first articles I wrote about when I first came to Liberty Nation, I guess 5 years ago, was about the diseases that illegal aliens bring in, like
Hmm.
smallpox and things that had been almost eradicated. And I quoted a black activist. He was a black illegal immigration activist, and I researched him as part of the quote, and they talked about that, how the Democrats court the black voter, and yet their policies are hurting the black worker on a very basic level. And illegal immigration was the heart of his argument. But I don't like to put it in racial terms like that, because this is hurting all of us. It's not just hurting blacks
Yeah.
and Hispanics. It's literally
No,
hurting
I
all of
agree.
us.
I agree.
And to me,
My point was that
no,
fiscally,
yeah,
the people most exposed to this tend to be minorities.
I really disagree that we all have to live in this cesspool
Sure.
and let's call it that. America has turned into a toilet today. And if you think I'm wrong, take a look at any big city. The quality of life in America has plummeted since 9/11, and that affects all of us. I don't agree that it affects minorities more. Yeah, yes, they are down lower on the ladder and they are not able to come up. But white people are getting pushed down there with them.
Sure.
We're all getting pushed down there. I really do truly believe it's a betrayal of the elites, is what I call it. It is a wealthy, a privileged class going rogue on the rest of us. And let me give you a couple of examples that I think are really revealing. The Republican Senate there are two Republican Senate candidates officially endorsed by the GOP establishment who were top executives for Bridgewater Associates. Bridgewater Associates is the largest hedge fund in America that does business with China. They are overwhelmingly involved with China. And in fact, Reuters just reported in January, they are doubling their investment in China this year. And Mitch McConnell's Senate Leadership Fund personally recruited Dave McCormick, who was the former CEO of Bridgewater, to run in Pennsylvania. He just missed out on getting the nomination in 2022 when Mehmet Oz got it. So that's one. And then Steve Daines, who runs the Senate Republican Senatorial Committee, personally recruited another former Bridgewater top executive, who is Pete Domenici, the longtime former senator in New Mexico. His daughter, former top Bridgewater associate, personally recruited by Steve Daines to run in New Mexico. So you have two Republicans who the Republican establishment were pushing through the primary process to become the GOP Senate candidates in two states, who are overwhelmingly tied to the hip with China. And yet we are told we have to stop the darn Democrats from doing this. It's a uniparty. It's going on in both sides. And if you don't understand that, this is, to me, it's not a left-right thing. This is a betrayal by a moneyed elite. And you're seeing it with these large companies with 800 Packer Sanitation, one of the companies I wrote about that was exploiting illegal alien child labor, $800 million in revenues. And that was in 2017. It's probably higher now. And they're doing this and they're being fined like $1 million, which is nothing to them. This is a betrayal by a wealthy class against the rest of us. It affects Black people, it affects Hispanics, it affects whites, it affects every single American. And I think those are the things that we need to talk about, and it transcends Republican Democrat politics. So to those who say, oh, we've got to beat the Democrats and save America, well, you know what? It's a lot more difficult than that. It's both sides and it's happening, and it's a wealthy class doing this to the rest of America.
Joe, we're approaching the end of the show, and I guess what I want to move on to now is to really talk about, we have this this idea that, I mean, the wonderful thing that why America has always been this to many other countries, especially my country, America's been this shining beacon of freedom. You have this robust constitution that, although it takes blows and sometimes bends here and there, it's always been something about which people can unite under, is the Constitution. So it's not America throughout its history. It's become something where it doesn't matter what your identity is. It's that you're all gathered under a single banner, and that banner is essentially it's a cry for freedom. It's that banner, and that's always been something wonderful. And obviously, during the 80s, there was always the great movies, Iron Eagle and whatnot, and they always sort of gave you this feeling like, oh, that's a country that loves itself in a good way, that's proud of itself. Whereas many other countries, especially the old European countries, I think it was Orwell who pointed out that in some circles it's considered rather disgusting to be proud of one's country. But that's never really been the case in America. But it seems to me, and this is just an opinion, Joe, that what it means to be an American is changing and not necessarily for the better. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I think that's it in a nutshell. I think it really needs to be driven home to people. And I think it has been in recent years, is we are really on the precipice of losing this country. This country, the heritage, everything that was bequeathed to us, we're on the point of losing. The Soviet Union didn't just happen overnight. There were factors involved in that development, and a lot of it. I am the biggest opponent of communism, that you'll ever find. But the Russian aristocracy was corrupt to the core. They were positively inviting the revolution that happened. So, we talk about moneyed elites and they don't care about the people. Well, there's going to be a reaction, and the reaction is quite ugly. What's interesting and what's happening in America is, I don't know if it's a reaction or a counter reaction, but it's sort of the empire strikes back. You're seeing the ruling establishment fighting back against what they know is bubbling up to the surface. Disinformation, things like that. They want to stifle this. They want to sit on a roiling pot.
You think that nothing's going to change with the upcoming November election, regardless of who wins?
I think things are going to change eventually, is my point. When you have 16-year-old kids being sucked into machinery and killed, that's not sustainable in the long term. They're trying to stifle a reaction that is going to happen. And the more they delay it, the worse it's going to be. So I hope for the sake of our country that it happens in 2024. But if it doesn't, if it's kicked down the can, it's only going to be more incendiary when it does happen, unfortunately. So yeah, I hope it changes to 2024, but they cannot maintain this broken status quo for much longer.
Yeah, as Ronald Reagan said, status quo is Latin for the mess we're in. Joe Schaefer, thank you ever so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that's just about it for this special edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Before I leave you with my final thoughts, I'd like to just thank today's guests, author and columnist Joe Schaefer, and you, the listeners, out there in the big wide world. Thank you for joining us. So here's my roundup. When I think of illegal immigration that is happening across pretty much all the westernized nations, I'm reminded of Winston Churchill's famous adage. He said, quote, "A simple way to take measure of a country is to look at how many want in and how many want out," end quote. So in many ways, it's a mark of achievement that so many people are willing to break the nation's laws to get in, but it comes with a cost too. And it's notable that voters are never genuinely asked about that. When Joe Biden ran for president in 2020, he did not tell the American people that they would see the greatest growth and flood of illegal immigrants the country had ever witnessed. Of course not. But that's what has occurred. And with that, as I say, is a cost. As we've discussed on today's show, we get child factory workers killed. We get sex trafficking of children. We get an increase in crime. We get gang violence. And we get fentanyl deaths to the tune of 250,000, 250,000 every year. Now that's 5 times as many Americans died during the entire Vietnam War conflict. And now, as the tide rises so high, we see once proud sanctuary cities jettisoning their high-minded principles and saying, no more, don't send us any more illegal immigrants. Why? Well, because the mass of humanity is an overwhelming force that, and this bears emphasizing, shows no signs of slowing down. Whatever the nation is dealing with now, imagine what it will be like when there are twice as many, 3 times as many or more. How long will this shining example of what it means to be a solid functioning nation cease to be just that? And then people start to want out. What would Churchill say then, I wonder? We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.